Economic Forum wants you to eat bugs. I kid you not. 2 years ago, they put out a report telling us that we should embrace the idea of insects as food. Better for the environment, they need less food, less water, take less space, and they're a good source of protein. Mainstream media, the likes of CNN, BBC, are also involved. In fact, the BBC suggested that grasshoppers could be a good idea. Time magazine wrote that bugs were healthy. Forbes ran an article championing insects as the future of food. Then you see celebrities like Nicole Kidman in a video enjoying hornworm, or Angelina Jolie eating spiders, Salma Hayek crunching a Mexican cricket, and Robert Downey Jr. recommending mealworm powder as a protein shake. Now, there's even a bakery in the UK that makes bread from cricket flour, produced by a company called Eat Grub, calling itself a leading insect food brand, as if that's meant to be enticing. Now, if the idea of eating insects makes you shudder, you might wonder why such attempts to normalize it. Is it the environment? Is it protein? Or something else? Namaste, and let's welcome back Dr. Ankit Shah to explain. Dr. Shah is a geoeconomics expert who's correctly predicted many trends and world events in the past, and was recently on this channel explaining all about de-dollarization and its impact on the shifting axes of world power. But what has that got to do with eating bugs? Dr. Shah, welcome, and please tell us.
Namaste. Always a pleasure to be on this channel. So we've been seeing this trend of a series of Western articles talking about how insects and bugs have a huge protein source, and it's kind of normal for human consumption to have those, and this they are relating with climate change, as in making it obligatory for the people to consume it in order to save the climate, which is just simply ridiculous. And they are comparing this with meat consumption, and also the other consumption of edible items. Now we all know that this kind of plantation of media articles increased, particularly after the Ukraine war. So we used to see some rare articles before 2021, but since the Ukraine war has started, this kind of articles are like all over the place in the mainstream media. Now we need to understand that this entire Ukraine script of war, wherein we understand that Ukraine is one of the biggest source of it's like the food basket in terms of the percentage of contribution that it does in terms of food items to the world, particularly the wheat. And we have seen that this script is purposely stretching since long, and some of the capitalist companies of the West, which are pocketing dollars, taxpayers' money with this stretched script of war, they are interested in increasing this length of this conflict, because they are earning huge amount of money out of this. So this is something that we also see in the Afghan war. It went on for 20 years. NATO did not get anything out of it, and at the end of it, there was an abrupt exit from Afghanistan, which is also, I believe it to be linked to de-dollarization, because as soon as the exit happened, Saudi Arabia signed a defense cooperation with Russia, principally negating the oil for security program which the dollarization had in the 1973, where the West promised security in exchange of all the trade would happen in dollar. So in terms of these bugs and insects article that we are seeing, there are some extreme capitalist trend we have seen where they have purchased a lot many of farmlands, and they are trying to have a communist kind of a rule for the land parcels that they are going to develop into exclusive zones of residence for whoever that they are going to accommodate inside. And not just that, we are also seeing influences on the Western governments via this capitalists, who are keen on finishing off farming. Now, one part we understand that you're not going to have a lot of supply from Asia and Gulf post de-dollarization, because lesser and lesser crude oil stock of Gulf is going to seek lesser and lesser manufacturing from China and Asia and other parts of Asia. So the priority post de-dollarization for Asia is that they are going to purchase energy, and they are going to give priority to Gulf and the Middle East in exchange of that energy for all the manufacturing and the farming supplies. So it is clearly understood that West is not going to have priority for trade in terms of food and manufacturing supplies from Asia going forward. Second, the flip with the de-dollarization that will happen in terms of valuations of the exchange rates with the pegged currency world that everybody will enter, particularly you will see that even if Asia wants to sell, the exchange rates are not going to be in favor of the West. They won't be in a position to buy, even if Asia wants to sell. So I believe that they are orienting with these articles the population of the West to prepare alternate sources of food and alternate sources of even the manufacturing supplies. Now, one of the important development that we see here, Navitaji, is today the news has come that Saudi Arabia and Iran are going to reset their diplomatic ties. So all those events and conflicts which kept the US dollar going as a reserve currency status, all those events are now reversing, which is why you will see that a lot of cooperation within the Asian and the Gulf countries, which will, in a way, sideline the Western countries in terms of supplies and trade. So a
This
lot.
this Saudi Arabia Iran cooperation you've just described, this is something that you had predicted last year, isn't that right?
Yes, I predicted that because we need to understand that the BRICS summit, which is happening this August in South Africa, Iran and Saudi Arabia are both applicants for that summit. Now, why
Mm.
are they applicants for the summit? Because they have got the realization that they were parking their savings in a fiat currency dollar, which has lost about 98% of its purchasing power since 1913. Now, which sane economy would want to park savings in a currency which has lost 98% of its purchasing power? So, because they want to go into a pegged currency world where currencies will be pegged with commodities, because once the crude oil stock, which is limited, everyone understands, they would want to have some savings which represent some real value. So, Saudi Arabia and Iran, as applicants to BRICS Plus, want to push the world towards a pegged currency, because that is the only way they would be having savings in a currency which can be used after their crude oil stock is over, right? So, in order to diversify their economy, they have to come together, which is why I predicted that both these nations would be prompted by Russia, India, China format to mend their ties and move forward for diversifying the economy out of the crude oil business, which is why I say that the West is going to have very, very tough time in terms of supplies.
Well, that what sounds really good. I mean, it makes the world a much safer place then if there's less tension and strife in the Middle East, because that's a bit of a tinderbox at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah. So post 1971, we have seen that what I call as the two buckets theory, wherein the Western alliance, the collective West, which we call it, would prompt healthy economic countries in Asia and Gulf that, look, you have got a rogue neighbor, and we are going to sanction and punish that rogue neighbor, and in exchange of that, you will have to continue with the US dollar. So this two buckets theory is now unraveling and reversing, which is why we are seeing this de-dollarization process. So you imagine once Saudi Arabia and Iran mend ties even to a decent level of understanding, there is no more role for the global policing that the West as a collective used to do. Similarly, Japan, Iraq, and Russia have launched a joint project, something unheard. Japan, as an US ally, doing a joint project with Russia. Similarly, Japan and China shifting a chunk of their bilateral trade into bilateral currencies. So, all the two bucket theory plans are now reversing, which is why the de-dollarization is going to be in full speed.
You know, you mentioned the US acting as a global policeman. I wanted if you could talk about this recent US intelligence report on the possibility of an armed conflict between India and China, and it actually called for US intervention. So one would think that the US has its hands full with the Ukraine war and noise about Taiwan. So why look for more trouble when neither side has asked for any intervention? What are your thoughts on that?
So, Navitaji, India and China, this war scenario, or even hallucinations of a full scale war between India and China, is something which is ridiculous, and I'll tell you why. No two big economy serious civilizations, because both of these are civilizational nations, no two big economy serious civilizational countries would ever think of a full scale, full spectrum war. So, despite the clashes that we have at the LAC and the issues that are outstanding between India and China, you have to understand that both these nations can rent war zones in smaller nations around. They don't need to clash with each other at the LAC. You have many other smaller geographies where you can throw some amount and use as a war zone for different kinds of conflicts. So as long as I understand geopolitics, this India China full scale war scenario or a threat is something that the Western collective purposely pushes, because there are interests of defense deals. The Southeast Asian nations would then be, desperate to have those defense deals and buying of weapons from the West. So I believe that this is a concocted theory. And I do not deny that there is a lack of trust between the two nations, India and China. And those hassles and, muscle fights is going to happen. Those clashes are going to happen because both the countries have different perceptions of what is LAC exactly. So, but you need to know that despite 2+ years of this LAC standoff, both the countries have maintained the agreement of no weapon use. So they are using bricks and bats and iron messes and everything, but the weapons are not allowed to both the armies. So I believe that no economy serious countries would go for that too of India and China size. And believe me, if Chinese had such an intent, then what were they waiting for? They were waiting for Rafales to flow in and S-400 to come in. I mean, they had at the entire Manmohan era of government in India where they could have done something if they wanted. So it's the mistrust which is being played up by the West, and I don't believe that these countries would ever go for a full spectrum war at the LAC. If there is possibility of some clash in the future of a military scale, I believe that would be somewhere around the Indian Ocean, not at the LAC.
So this kind of fits into your two buckets theory, right? You have one neighbor which is being sanctioned, China, and then you have the other one where they're trying to sell more weapons to, which is
Yeah.
India.
So not just weapons, friend shoring is the new word which is coming in, where they are looking at shifting the manufacturing facilities to India, and also the high tech transfer that they are now willing to share with India. So this propping up of the two baskets continues, but I believe overall in the Gulf and the Asian region, this theory has is now reversing. So even India and China, you will see once that BRICS currency format pilot transactions begin, you will see a series of cooperation, at least on the financial front, if not at the military front.
But I remember a tweet from you where you talked about Xi Jinping, or is it the foreign minister, Chinese foreign minister, saying that the two countries should look for their civilizational cooperation as they try to modernize.
Yes. So we have seen a change in the foreign minister of China. We had Wang Yi up until last year, and now we have the Chinese ambassador to US promoted as the new foreign minister in China. So the March 2022 meeting of the unannounced visit which Wang Yi had in India, at that point in time, he noted this fact to Ajit Doval, that our NSA, that India and China, the kind of national rejuvenation that both these countries will have a far reaching impact all over the world. This was the exchange which both of them had. Now, this time, when the foreign minister, Chinese foreign minister, attended the G20 and had a bilateral with our external affairs minister Jaishankar, he repeated the statement and he said this is now once in a life century opportunity between the two nations to cooperate for respective national rejuvenation. Now, viewers need to know that this terminology is very interesting because national rejuvenation in China is directly linked to merging Taiwan with the mainland. So when the Chinese foreign minister says that we need to cooperate in the wisdom of achieving this, respective national rejuvenation, he's probably hinting at POK, the Pakistan occupied Kashmir. There is a good possibility that he's trying to indirectly hint that both of us can have our goals done if we understand this kind of cooperation is possible.
That's interesting. While we're on the subject of China, what's prompting them to think about trying to increase their birth rates from this one-child policy that they had, and this whole idea of giving more holidays, increasing the length of festivals, because that's kind of not what you would expect. You'd expect governments to want people to work more to increase productivity in the society. So why is this? This seems to be a bit of an about turn.
Yeah. So there are two very interesting events that happened in the previous century. The first one was the 1962 war with India. Now, the CPC of the Chinese Communist Party, which set in 1962, decided on the cultural revolution which began from 1965 and 66 onwards. So, my understanding of geopolitics is that this cultural revolution which China wanted to do within China, 1962 war was a precursor to that. It was their requirement to do it so, to give a physical punch to Dharma. Now, there's a very interesting statement by China's ambassador to US, Hu Shi, some 20 plus years before 1962, where he says India has culturally dominated China for centuries without firing a bullet across. So, what he's talking about is the India influenced religious practices and festivals, particularly Buddhism, which was so much prevalent throughout the Chinese population. Uh, Through this, India had a cultural domination over China. So, it's not a surprise that when they planned for a cultural revolution from 65 66, they had to give a physical punch to India in 1962, so that the pride on the religious practices and the dharmic influence of India over the Chinese population, that pride falls apart, and after that the entire brutal cultural revolution started. Now, what Xi Jinping could not understand, I mean, the Chinese Communist Party could not understand back in 1962 was that this very dharmic and religious practices and the festivals was an economic cycle that pushed up their economics. Now, in 2023, Xi Jinping is saying, let's go back to those festivals. He is saying he's increasing the days of festivals so that consumption and a spending cycle and domestic consumption increases within the Chinese economy. Because, as I said, post de-dollarization, a lot of exports are not going to be happening, especially to the West. So the people need to be oriented back for the internal cycle. Now, the previous two terms of Xi Jinping, he had a clash with his premier, Li Keqiang. Now, Li Keqiang obviously had a financial background in terms of expertise, and he was a competitor of Xi Jinping before two terms in terms of that president position. Very interesting. This guy was demoted in the November 2022 Congress, and as we know that President Xi Jinping is now president for life. So what has happened very interesting is that the two guys who were on the Chinese Politburo, Li Keqiang and Wang, both of them were pro-West, pro-exports model. Both of them demoted from the Politburo, and now the Politburo that you have is completely anti-exports. So Xi Jinping was talking internal cycle for two terms, clashing with Li Keqiang. Now Li Keqiang is out of picture, and now he has a full authority to become anti-exports economy. Now, there's another interesting event of the previous century. So Deng Xiaoping visited President Carter in January 1979. He came there and he was in awe with the kind of industrialization that the American economy had. So he said that I want to open up Chinese economy. Whatever the negotiations they had in that meeting, he comes back to China and declares a brutal single child policy. So my understanding says that it was the US exchange with him that you cut down your domestic consumption, we pass on the technology to you to become the manufacturing giant, and you are going to be helping our spending model of the West by supplying the production that you do in your economy. So this entire technology give and take was based on cutting down domestic consumption home with a single child policy. Now you see the reversal today in 2023. Xi Jinping is saying increase the birth rates. A complete reversal of both the events 1962 and 1979. So you see how de-dollarization is moving forward.
Is that why we see African countries not very happy with Western leaders? You know, you had, I think Macron visited Congo and there were protests. The Prime Minister of Mali has not been very happy with the West. And in general, I mean, there seems to be quite an anti-West sentiment in that continent. You know, what's the reason for that?
Well, Nabitaji, it is throughout the world. The sentiment is not just about the African continent, and I'll tell you exactly why. Because in the pegged currency world, the commodities are going to be in the basket for representing the currency, and Africa is full of those natural resources. So that becomes a natural war zone for the big powers to do the power play over there. Now, we already understand that France still dominates a lot of internal policies of many African nations. And these African nations are now realizing that they need to have their independent policies. It's like de-dollarization is also equal to decolonization. So they are opposing, and it's not just Macron. Remember when Secretary Blinken went to Africa, the African minister was sitting next to him and giving right and left. She was like, you don't tell us what we are supposed to do. So this is happening all across. Now when we see an FTA between Australia and India, soon after the FTA, the Australian government is saying we are going to remove the British monarchs from the currency. It is the same decolonization wave which Africa is talking to the West. It is the same thing when the American African community in California is asking for reparations for colonization tortures of the past from the American state. It is happening all across the board, not just one or two events. And now we see that how just recently the news has come that a US senator is talking about usage of forces on Mexico. Now, we understand that Mexico just now found out some lithium reserves, and they have forcibly nationalized those reserves. So it's not going to be for private companies. And even if it happens with the excavation with the private companies, it's going to be completely under regulation. So a lot many of these mines is what all countries are going to search for. United States particularly has given an all stock takeover bid for the Australian biggest gold producing company. So we are seeing that Pentagon is asking for budget for taking a stake in Canadian mines. So a lot of clash coming in the US neighborhood now, because the manufacturing is going to shift from China to the West, and America is looking at neighbors as a first stopgap arrangement for, because manufacturing causes pollution at the end of the day around the surroundings, right? So, and it is depletion of natural resources in addition. So a lot of clash with the African subcontinent is also relevant with respect to these mines and the natural resources. One, because the currencies are going to be pegged with these commodities which are going to be mined. Two, because the entire manufacturing and supply chain is about the supply of these raw materials. So that is where it is all heading.
How does that impact the find of lithium reserves in Jammu in India? Is the government going to nationalize those to prevent the same kind of activities by the corporates or by the US?
So we are going to see one of the report which has come is about cooperation with Mexico on an alliance of all lithium reserves countries, which would be able to then negotiate how to redistribute and be able to coordinate to supply to all the interested parties, because we all understand that the electric vehicle revolution post crude oil world is going to be based on several alternatives, and one of the biggest alternative is lithium for those batteries that need to be made. So in terms of Indian economy, I do not see 100% nationalization kind of thing, because they are open for public bids. But in terms of regulation, I certainly feel that the mining industry is going to face a lot of regulations in the de-dollarized world, because currency is going to be pegged with these commodities, so the supply is going to be regulated.
Does this de-dollarization have any impact on the UK India FTA, the free trade agreement, which is doesn't seem to be getting done at the moment?
So it's very interesting to see that there are the traditional US allies, particularly Canada, UK, and Australia. Now, one part of the free trade agreements which is common with all three of the traditional US allies is the education sector. And Australia has taken a first mover advantage over here. They've already launched two campus projects in the gift city. They are Deakin University and one more. The Australian Prime Minister is right now in India. So the entire natural resources of Australia is up for grabs for the Indian businesses before any foreign forces would try to dominate those deals that happens. So I think Australia has moved out of this American dominance, which is particularly why you see that they are saying that the British monarchs would be removed from the currency. So Australia has taken the lead over here. In terms of Canada, the FTA is sabotaged with respect to a lot of Khalistani element events vis-a-vis India. The protest and the kind of encouragement which is directly or indirectly given by state and non-state actors over there. In terms of UK, it is very interesting. You had a change of three prime ministers while the FTA negotiations were going on. So post Brexit, it was very clear that UK needs this FTA with India, desperately needs it. Now, the first Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, an entire delegation was called to Delhi for pushing the negotiations. And we saw how it was sabotaged by adding Russia, Ukraine in the agenda item. Now, an FTA negotiation has no locus standi on India's relations with Russia, but it was purposely done. The FTA was sabotaged, Boris Johnson knocked out. Then came Liz Truss. Now, one member from the government, Suella Braverman, I guess, she commented something on Indians. Again, the FTA got sabotaged. And then now Rishi Sunak has come, and this time it was BBC documentary. Now, I know, I mean, a lot many of external uh, deep state elements from the West are purposely sabotaging this FTA. And there is particular reason for that. If all traditional American allies would have individual FTAs signed with the Indian government, uh, the role of United States would be decimated, completely decimated. Now, we also need to understand that the Japanese Prime Minister is going to come for a visit. And Japan holds a big chunk of the US Treasury. And Japan, particularly, has got no hints if the West, collective West, is going to oppose this de dollarization, restrict, engage, or what. There's no clue being given to Japan. It is at the receiving end of this de-dollarization process, which is why I think Japan also is now slowly moving out of the clutches of the Western collective. Perhaps they have realized that they don't fall into the definition of the West, what we call as the West, Australia and Japan. So, the Prime Minister is going to be here for 3 days. And I believe that with the kind of Russia, Iraq, Japan joint project, and China, Japan bilateral transactions outside of the US dollar, I believe a lot of movement is going where they are coming out from the Western alliance.
So this de-dollarization is happening in many different shapes and forms, and it definitely seems like it's well on its way. What sort of time frame do you put on it? I mean, where are we in that chain of, when we started and when we completely switched to an alternative?
So, as I've predicted, I guess last year, that there will be a banking crisis, there will be a currency crisis, and there will be a stock market rout. There will be a rout in terms of the pension funds that the people have in the West. What some of the trailers you can easily see today, you had this Silicon Valley Bank, which lost a huge stake, and now it is in crisis. And all the entire IT sector and the startup sector, which is linked to that Silicon Valley Bank, is now going to face existential problem as well. So I believe that the cycle has already started. In terms of US Treasury, you are seeing that none of the allies have parked their savings since January 2022, which is why the entire inflation has to first go to the Western population itself, which US dollar was so easily able to pass on to the rest of the world. Now it comes directly to the Western population. So several parts are already moving. After the Africa summit in August, I believe uh, the pilot transactions will begin of the BRICS currency. Certainly, there will be consideration for new applicants, Iran and Saudi Arabia joining. And I believe that the crude oil sales will begin outside of the US dollar. And once that happens, it is almost over, kind of a thing, which means that the endless printing capacity of the US dollar will stop, which means the West will now have a complete, consistent, high interest rate regime. And high interest rate regime means no more kind of innovation that the West used to have, and no more attraction to immigrants to come to the West, because this high talent would not be okay with a 60% cut on the kind of salary levels which are today. I mean, till up until the last year it was there. So we believe that the kind of capital trimming that the Western economy will see, negotiations will begin next year, by mid next year it should begin about whether West wants to go to a pegged currency world, or how is it that Asia and Gulf pegged currency will be able to trade with the Western countries. So the entire fate of IMF, World Bank, and the World Trade Organization hangs on these negotiations.
Interesting. So, moving on to a different topic, education. This is seen as a sign of progress, right? It's supposed to give everyone equal opportunities to learn, cultivate their cognitive faculties, improve their position in life. But then there are others who've studied the history of Western public education and say that its primary role is not to uplift and enlighten, but to act as a form of social control. Now, India's education system is still largely modeled on the Western template, which the British left behind. Can you talk about that model and what its purpose was, and how could it change in a de-dollarized world?
Yeah. So the British classroom format was imposed on all colonies of Britain, and the fundamental intention here was that for an industrialized Europe, a lot of raw materials and resources would be sent to Europe, and the colonies, people of the colonies, would have English language imposed on them as the operating language. So, all of a sudden, a country with the 85% high literacy rate became illiterate in one stroke with the imposition of the language. Uh, then the British classroom format was devised in a format where, you have slaves coming out for predefined jobs under the British governance. The Babu culture that is left behind that we know as of today, but unfortunately, that entire classroom model format of churning out slaves for factory supply as a unit of labor became the education format for the entire world. So people were, herded in within four walls of classrooms with predefined syllabus given to them, and an external push of keeping them within these four walls so that they are not aware of the market realities. An entire chunk of Asian population, which was an enterprising based society, a perpetually rich society, was turned into a jobber based dependent economy, poor economy, and an entire format where humans are trafficked from classrooms to companies for jobs, because you have 15 to 20 years invested within those four walls, completely out of touch with the market realities, so there's no possibility of enterprising now. And this became the education format for the entire world. Now, post de-dollarization, what is going to happen is, since the IT sector and the services sector, both of them were born out of the fiat reserve currency dollar, both of these are going to see a lot many of erstwhile glorified jobs totally vanish. And once these jobs vanish, particularly in the services sector, the immediate question is going to be, what sense does this British classroom model make? If you are going to invest 15 to 20 years and you do not have surety of even the next 5 years in terms of some economic activity. So I believe this entire decolonization that is going to happen with de-dollarization, uh, India would come back with its traditional education, skills-based Gurukul format of education, where people would be empowered for enterprising model more than seeking jobs after completing the education.
It sounds like a great idea. It's it's surprising that after 75 years of independence, they're still following the same template that was left behind. Which the world's moved on since then, and you'd think that a country would want to rediscover its its indigenous pride and culture and values, but that doesn't, so far at least, it doesn't seem to have happened in India. But what you're describing, this de-dollarization, could be the straw that breaks the camel's back. It might just tip everything over the edge and force people to look for alternative, better models of education.
100%. And
Yeah.
this entire classroom format was devised so that a memory based format is kind of a feminization of men, so that they are not able to do entrepreneurship. Not just that, they are not able to think of independence from Britain. That was the logic and the thought process behind which this classroom format was designed. uh, so I think that once this fiat currency world closes, a lot many of service sector jobs are gone. This is going to be the first question. What about this classroom model? I mean, if you're wasting 15 years, and if you just look at the irony, Navitaji, um, throughout those 15 years, the child's natural curiosity is killed. He is asked to focus on what he is not good at to improve the marks, and that too memory based for those 3 hours of exam to give him a statement of what he is about. uh, and imagine the next 30 years, the HR fellow of some company is trying to find out what the guy is good at. Can you look at the irony? He's wasted 15 years investing into what he's not good at, and now the HR fellow is trying to find out what he is good at. So and when I talk about this co-education system which was brought in the British classroom model, because there were, I mean, even just South India had about 6 lakh plus girls gurukuls, established ones in ancient India, before the British cancelled this entire Indian education system out. So they brought about this co-education format, particularly because the Abrahamics look at 18th century industrialization, women as a unit of labor for temporary GDP, as I explained in the previous talk as well. So under that format, men and women both are an equal unit of labor for factories. So I think this entire co-education was not about equality. It was about herding women as well into a unit of labor. Now nobody would dwell upon that the enterprising that the ancient India and Asian economies had, both India and China giving more than 50% to the world GDP. Each of these Indian women were big business tycoons. Nobody's going to bring upon these facts. So whenever we challenge the British classroom model and the job system, the question comes that, hey, you are talking about patriarchy. We are not talking about patriarchy. Man and women both were enterprising, right? That's how rich the economy was. If we were giving 27% of the world GDP, we were giving that without English language. There was no English language. All right. So the language has no connection with the GDP or economic contribution. As long as the society was enterprising, the language was not a barrier. So, this English language imposed as the new operating language of the world can certainly be reversed. We see the French talking in French language, the Germans talking in German language, Japanese talking in Japanese language. Why are we talking in English, right? The Indian subcontinent. So we need to build this narrative back, that the regional languages, regional cultures have to bounce back, so that we come out of this decolonization impact on our minds. I mean, the countries, Britain left the countries politically, but the colonization of the minds is still existing.
Hmm. I think I know in the UK, in London at least, a few weeks back, there was an event at the High Commission here, which was an attempt to revitalize native languages in India. And I think they chose about 18 or 25 languages that were represented. So maybe it's already started. At least I hope it has.
And Navitaji, the entire civilizational wisdom is about how much complex your language is, how many layers of interpretation the language has the capacity for. That is the civilizational wisdom which the previous generation passed on to you. So it is very much necessary to preserve that civilizational wisdom accumulated throughout generations. And that represents how old your country as well is. An Indian kid today can, it's like a breakfast for him, three, four languages. That's not the capacity of a Western DNA. So those people who talk about secularism and inclusiveness and democracy in the West, uh, I mean, what they are talking about, they should look at India. That's the capacity of the Indian DNA to digest three, four languages like some breakfast.
Hmm. Talking about civilizational wisdom, um, as a species, we seem to be moving into uncharted waters. We've gone from technology as a tool to a wearable and soon to invade the body through nanotech and transhumanism. And we also have very sophisticated AI, the likes of ChatGPT. Now, whilst in modern Western society, which is mostly driven by fear and greed, there's a tremendous potential for misuse and digital enslavement. How do you see the role of AI in a Sanatan economics model?
Uh, that's a good one. I mean, the viewers need to know about this. So, technology as a factor of production, when we talk about the four main factors of production, we have man, machine, market, and money. Now, since the West believes that we are the body and not the soul is just a vehicle, they believe in this only one life concept. Their focus is only on finite as wealth, which means from the four main factors of production, the Abrahamics are focusing on machine and material factor of production. And they have reduced men as not just the prime pivot of the economic activity, but they have reduced men as a simple factor of production, competing with other factors of production, and not the other factors of production complementing him in performance. Right? This is how technology is moving ahead. So there are
Mhm.
serious concerns about this when uh, when the machine factor of production, which is technology, if that is going to compete with the man factor of production, and in terms of economies of scale, if extreme capitalism is only going to look forward for profits, then it is very much possible. I should not say this, but all the the bullocks, the bulls, were killed after tractors were invented. They are directly being sent to being cut. So if man factor of production is going to be reduced to a level where technology is going to take up all the economic activity snatched from him, I do not understand how you are going to justify payments to the man factor of production, and how the state is going to take this entire burden of social welfare for this unemployed or unactive, unproductive human resource. So this is exactly where I believe that Sanatan economics model has to come up with a balance, where technology as a machine factor of production has to only complement the manufacture of production and not compete with it. So, as I'm working on this book on the Sanatan economics model, I believe that since Indian dharmas talk about life cycles, um, we focus particularly on the man factor of production, how he is being nurtured, and all other factors of production complementing him and not competing with him. So, in terms of integral humanism, which Din Dayal Upadhyay very clearly talks about, that there has to be a Bhartiya format of technology which needs to come in, so that we don't have these zombies crowd running muck around the street, claiming for socialist freebies, because at the end of the day, if technology is going to remove them from work, this entire burden is going to come to the state for their living and sustenance. And we do not want those few capitalists to push us to the slaughterhouse, do we? Right? That's where extreme capitalism is taking. So I don't think that this kind of civilizational wisdom of life cycle is something that we can expect from the West. I think it is India's time to lead the world and give this guiding light on the Sanatan economics model, that man is not just a factor of production. He is the pivot of the entire economic activity that is going on this planet, and we need to preserve the life cycles, which means he has to be productively employed in an economic activity, whether it is a job model or an enterprising model. Technology and other factors of production will always be a second class status compared to the man factor of production. So the economics model that I am deriving for the forthcoming book on Sanatan economics, I'm going to come up with new indexes for the world. So all the Western indexes does not work in terms, because they do not have the civilizational wisdom of preserving the life cycles. They believe in one life, and they are actually taking humanity to a disaster. This needs to be urgently be addressed in terms of, and India is the only civilization which can do this.
And where do mandirs fit in your Sanatan economics model?
It's the same life cycle format which we talk about. So the mandir ecosystem was designed in a way that the entire life cycle is preserved. So you have a tourism economy around the mandir ecosystem. And if you see the industrialized cities in the West, say for example Detroit, because the Western capitalists, under this Adam Smith capitalism of efficiency and labor division benefits, they see finite stuff as wealth, which is why the industrialized cities become ghost towns ultimately, because when you face that finite resources constraints of supply, this is what happened to the cities. But if you look at Indian mandir towns, all of them are buzzing with life and economics, be it Kashi, be it Tirupati, right? So because they support the entire life cycle preservation. So if you look at our Bhagwans, Ganpati Bappa would come this year, there will be Sarjan, then there will be festivities of entire economics moving around that ecosystem, and then there will be Visarjan, which is a symbolism for death, and next year he is coming back again, right? So this life cycle wisdom is not just taught in the Sanatan economics model. They are also teaching you that you need to move your economic activities in a way where the life cycle is completely preserved. Similarly, if you look at Durga Mata, she is also submerged in water, and she comes back next year again. So if we are applying life cycles to the Bhagwans, we certainly have life cycles. So in the Mandir ecosystem, one part of that which you see as the tourism economy around, second part is the entire enterprising for surviving the life cycles. Each of the Bhagwans need a specific flower. They need a specific food item. They need a specific fruit, a specific dish, a specific species of rice, because that is what they call as akshat. So this entire biodiversity is maintained, because uh, you have to do that. You have to bestow it for the Bhagwan, and you need to preserve it if you have to do that activity on a routine basis. So all this biodiversity used to be maintained. And you look at the kind of economics which runs around the festivals, you automatically pass on cash to the lower strata of society in a celebratory mode, where they are able to sell all those small items. And you look at the kind of customization. If you talk about Diwali, on one stall you will see one kind of diyas, right? On the other stall you will see customized other kind of design. This is not something which can be industrialized, because these festivals are going to be oncoming every year. So nobody's going to invest a massive capital and make it a standardized product. So enterprising continues this way through the Sanatan economics model. The extreme capitalism cannot take over these activities, which is why you see the mandir towns still surviving, and they will survive till eternity because they preserve the life cycle in the entire process. There's a celebration of the life cycles. It happens in a celebratory format. Even if the cash is moving out of your pocket, it is happening in a celebratory format. You don't need the state based compulsory mandatory taxation and socialist freebies to be given to those zombie crowds that you now create with extreme communism and capitalism. This is how life cycle is celebrated in the Sanatan model.
Wow. Thank you, Doctor. I mean, that's amazing. It's a completely different paradigm, and it's so inspiring and exceptional. I can't say anything better. I mean, you said it all, the way you described it. And I think on that positive note, we'll end there. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for today. And namaste, and see you next time.
Namaste.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.